back. But then now I saw that the anniversary of the Civil Rights Act was coming up in 1984. And I thought someone ought to present some of the things they're not likely to hear in this discussion. And so I then did the Civil Rights Rhetoric or Reality. And finally I got back to the Marxism, and that came out some years later.
You've mentioned a couple of times how you say things and think differently than others. And I want to read, it'll take me just a minute here to read this paragraph and ask you to explain it further. This is deep in the book, and when I read it, it kind of popped out, and I wanted to ask you what you meant by all this. You say, any fundamental re-examination of the assumptions behind preferential policies, that's the name of the book, and still more so, any resulting change of policies, can expect to encounter their vocal, bitter, and determined opposition, including inevitable charges of racism against outsiders, labels of traitor put on any members of their own group who disagree with them, who disagree publicly with them, and whatever other claims or charges seem likely to be politically effective. When you said labels of traitor put on any members of their own group who disagree publicly with them, were you talking about yourself?
Only as one among many. Randall Kennedy up at Harvard did a very fine article in the Harvard Law Review last June, for which he was denounced as an academic minstrel and other things because he was out of step. I mean, people who raise their heads will set off a search and destroy mission because people have a lot at stake, and they're sitting on a house of cards. They have many assumptions which simply cannot be examined carefully because those assumptions will collapse and they will fall from a very high position to a very low position. And they are not about to tolerate people questioning what they're saying.
Is there a way for you to put it in a nutshell about what people of, say, your own race say about you that they don't like what you say about
wait. I think one of the ways that the organized noisemakers have succeeded is saying that what they're saying is what their race is saying. My race is not saying that about me. Those particular individuals who are a small minority themselves within the black community, who have a vested interest in many of these programs, they are saying that. But when I checked out of my hotel this morning, you know, the black security guard came over and says, are you Sowell? And I said, yes, and he shook my hand warmly, and he walked me the length of the corridor, and we talked about this and about that. And that's not at all an uncommon experience for me. So it's not Sowell versus blacks, it's the black intellectuals. And the black intellectuals are no more typical of the black population than white intellectuals are of the white population. But they have a very large vested interest in certain beliefs which underlie various programs from which they benefit enormously. And as I point out in the book, this is common around the world, that the elites benefit from preferential programs, even when those programs are in the name of the masses. The masses do not benefit. In the case of the current so-called Civil Rights Act, the masses are going to lose big if that law goes into effect.
Why?
Because employers will not want to hire as many blacks in the jobs for which most blacks will be applying, because those will not be jobs as rocket scientists or as doctors or as any of those things. And therefore, they'll want to hold down the percentages down there to what they can do in the higher ranks, which is going to be much less. And so you're sacrificing the working class blacks for the benefit of the professional elite.
How do the intellectual elite, both white and black, get to the position that they do in this country that you disagree with?
I mean, how do they have the influence they have?
Well, no, but what's their, from what your discussions over the years, what's their thought process that gets them there? Is it emotion or is it fact?
Emotion largely, but also a large amount of self-interest, increasingly self-interest. I think that if you went back, you know, into the 60s, you'd find people with different views like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. But I think that both those men believed in what they said. Whereas today, you have people who are simply professional hustlers. And again, this is not peculiar to blacks or peculiar to the United States or even peculiar to racial issues. That organizations typically, many movements are set off by idealistic people who want to promote some good for mankind or for some group. But as time goes by and as they succeed, they will be followed by people who can use these things for their own self-interest. And that's been the history of regulatory agencies in the government. It's been the history of, I think, of religions, that the first Christians who were being persecuted by the Roman Empire were not in it, you know, for what they could get, because all they were going to get is trouble. But once Christianity became the state religion, this became a very lucrative career for some people. and then you get an entirely different kind of person coming in at that point, and we can have an entirely different kind of movement.
Let me, I've got it marked off here, and I know that I can find it. I know you're going to know the stuff right off the top of your head, but when you got to education in the United States, you talked about affirmative action, and you came up with some statistics, and I wanted to ask you about. Well, I look for, here it is. You said that at the University of California at Berkeley, for example, where the entering freshman class has been described as, quote, wonderfully diverse, unquote, because the, quote, class closely reflects the actual ethnic distribution of California high school students. These are your words. More than 70% of black students fail to graduate.
Yes.
Why?
Because they're mismatched with Berkeley. That is, these students, the average black student at Berkeley is above the national average on test scores. It's just that the average white student is further above the national average, and the average Asian student further above than the white students. And so in that atmosphere, these students who have every qualification to succeed are artificially turned into failures. And the only beneficiary of that is the University of California at Berkeley. Because what they've effectively done is rented these bodies for window dressing for a few years. And then when they're through with them, they're put aside, and a new bunch of bodies are brought in.
Have you told them that?
Oh, yes.
And what do they say to you?
Oh, different things. I remember one fellow saying, "Oh, Tom, I'm just a little guy. I can't do anything about this," which, you know, wonderful. But the people who really have the influence are not the people I've talked with. Those people know exactly what they're doing. There's another group, I guess, that benefits from this. You have an establishment there, a black studies establishment, who needs students to be in their classrooms, and these students serve those purposes. People who have political movements have people they can mobilize for those movements while those students are there. It's very much like what happens in athletics, that you have students who come in, as long as they can score touchdowns, the coach is happy. The fact that these students don't graduate is not the coach's problem. His problem is how to hold on to his six-figure salary and his job. And the students have to be sacrificed, and they are sacrificed.
Well, let's take it first from the student standpoint. Of 312 black students entering Berkeley in 1987, all were admitted under affirmative action. And you say that 70% of those failed to graduate. What would you tell those students to do under the circumstances, knowing that statistic?
I would tell them what I've told students in general of all races to do, which is to go to schools that match your educational capabilities at the time. Because you need to be matched with a school. You shouldn't try to go to where the glitzy name is or what have you. Now, unfortunately, many of the minority students have such low income that they must go to wherever the money is. And the money is disproportionately at the kinds of schools that they will find very, very difficult to graduate from.
All right, let's take it from the standpoint of the school. You're at the school and you want to do good. You say it doesn't work. What would you tell the school to do?
To admit students on the basis of their qualifications.
But what happens if they come up and statistically they have nothing close to the population?
Well, they won't have anything at the top level. But we have more than 3,000 colleges and universities in this country. Every human being that's not severely mentally retarded is perfectly qualified to be at one of those institutions. I mean, there are institutions where if you can fill out the application form, you're qualified to do the work. And there are others where if you're not in the top 1 or 2%, your chances of making it are extremely slim. And it's precisely these second places that they want to send black students, that they don't send white students of the same level of ability. And it's not at all surprising that they run into the academic problems they do. Let me give you another example that's not in the book. At MIT, the average black student is at the top 10% nationwide in mathematics, and in the bottom 10% at MIT. And 1/4 of them don't make it. Now, when you realize how few black students at that level, to lose 1/4 of them, you can't afford that. I think there's another larger loss that you have. You have the kid who goes to a top-level school, and he wants to be a chemist or whatever. And now he gets there and he finds he cannot learn chemistry as it's taught at that school. Does not mean he can't learn chemistry. It means that if they have very high-pressure students, they can teach this stuff at a very fast rate, skipping on explanations, skipping over steps in the mathematics, and these students will all pick that up as they go along. He may find that he can't keep up with that. And so in order to survive, he switches into some easy subject, which may be some ethnic studies program or what have you. And so someone who could have gotten a first-rate education at a good college ends up getting a third-rate education at a top college, or ends up flunking out altogether.
You know, when you read your books that you've published, Economics and Politics of Race, Ethnic America, Markets and Minorities, Pink and Brown People, they all have, not all of them, but a lot of them have race as the basis for what you're studying. When you think about and write about race, are you doing so approaching it intellectually, or because you feel you have this as a mission, personally, to better your race?
Well, I think both. A book like Civil Rights Rhetoric and Reality, I would never have written except for some practical purpose. That is, I had been through the subject before. I resisted throughout the 1960s all sorts of efforts to get me to write on race, because I said, I'm not an expert on that. There are people who study this for all their lives, and let them do it. And then I began to read some of the stuff they were writing, and I realized what nonsense it was. And I said, if this is what the professionals are doing, then we should try an amateur to do this. And once I got into it, I realized there were so many terrible things that the general public is simply unaware of. And there are so many bills of goods being sold to the public by people who personally gain from this stuff. I mean, when you sell a program, you become the program director, you become the consultant, you become all of that sort of thing. And I just needed to debunk some of that. And I think that's the reason I've written them. Then once I start to write them, I write them as I would approach any other subject intellectually.
Does it make you mad when you see somebody, say, of a hard right-wing persuasion using you to further their own particular prejudices?
Well, there are so few opportunities for my ideas to get into print that I don't have the luxury of doing that. But it would bother me. I haven't seen much of that, actually. I haven't seen much of that.
Have you seen discrimination in your own life because of the views you take?
Now, I would know about it. That whoever would discriminate against me would have the good sense to keep me from finding out.
Well, let me re-ask it. Do you find that the media would ignore what you have to say because of the views you take? Have you ever sensed that in this?
Oh, sometimes, although it's not so much being ignored as being distorted beyond recognition. A terrible thing happened some years ago on CBS Morning News when they tried to represent me as someone who believes that blacks are genetically inferior. And I had written, at least half a dozen articles attacking the thesis of Arthur Jensen. And so much so that the BBC had once wanted to arrange a debate between me and Jensen, and neither of us wanted to be bothered. But I was thinking, why is it that in London they understand what my position is, but in Washington they can't find out what it is? Particularly since it's been in print repeatedly and at enormous length. I conducted a large survey of IQs about 20 years ago, collected about over 100,000, and wrote all this stuff up. So it's a matter of public record. And yet to lie like that is just too much.
What's the state of prejudice in the United States today compared to, earlier years in your life?
It depends on the base year, like most comparisons. If you take 30 years ago, greater. Certainly greater in the academic world. In the book that I wrote about colleges, I urge minority parents not to think that because they had a good experience on a particular college campus 30 years ago, that their children will have that good an experience today, because the racial tension is enormous on many campuses. The colleges themselves try to say that they're victims of the racism of the larger society. And in point of fact, the racism on the campuses is greater than that in the larger society, in many campuses. And what I worry about is that they're going to graduate into the general society, blacks and whites alike, who hate each other's guts, and who can be the leaders of new racial strife for the future.
What's causing that on college campuses?
One of the factors is the preferential policies. But it's more than just that, because that in itself sets in motion a series of events which add to the original resentment over the preferential policies. That is, you put yourself in the position of a black kid who comes out of a ghetto school, and he's gone through for 12 years with nothing but A's and B's, without a great deal of effort. And now he finds himself for the first time in his life in a predominantly white environment, and he finds that when he works twice as hard as he's ever worked, all he gets back for his work is a D. And that there is also a minority establishment. This is true not only of blacks, but of minorities in general. Establishment which tells him, yes, this is the racism on this campus. That the white power structure is trying to keep you down. And it has to have a certain plausibility to it. It would have had a certain plausibility to me.